Among those pet names is Puppy Toes and my personal favorite, Niles Little Wart. Hello, and welcome to the 34th installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at the 10th episode of Season 2, entitled Burying a Grudge. This episode has production code 210, so we're totally in order here, and we will remain so for the next 3 weeks. Burying a Grudge originally aired on November 29th, 1994. And like last week, we don't have Friends nor Seinfeld on this time out for comparison. This episode attracted 22.5 million viewers, a decline of just over 1.5 million from last week's episode. Given we are coming off a 2-part episode featuring the return of Lilith, it really isn't surprising there's a decline here. And to be honest, I was more surprised we lost so few viewers than anything else. This outing, we have Andy Ackerman returning to direction for the first time since episode 15 of Season 1, and the first time since he took over as the regular director for Seinfeld. This is Ackerman's penultimate episode of Frasier. He'll direct one more time this season with episode 15. I'm a big fan of Ackerman's direction, and find him to be one of the more talented directors we've had on the series, and I think it's a shame we'll only see him one more time after this. To complement Ackerman's direction, we have David Lloyd on writing duty, who joined Ackerman during his last outing. You can't tell a crook by his cover. There are some similarities between these two episodes, although I think the prior outing from this pair was a stronger overall experience. Lloyd has another 14 episodes in him, which will compose of at least one episode in every season, except for seasons 9 and 10. This week, we're starting the episode out with the red blinking dot on top of the Space Needle. This intro is by far the most common intro, making its 10th total appearance here, and 3rd for the season, making it both the most common intro for the series and season at this point in time. We start this episode out with Roz missing from her post, and Frasier looking for her. We've seen this before, and it goes well with Roz's character. She's frequently late or out of the room when she shouldn't be for various reasons, be it gossip or, in this case, eyeballing the new 19-year-old intern. I like Roz's predatory nature towards men, as she's always reminded me of a female version of Sam Malone. With that said, Frasier is horrified at the prospect of her pursuing so young a man, and calls Roz Mrs. Robinson. It's a shame we had Art Garfunkel on a couple weeks ago, because this is a reference to The Graduate, which we talked about quite a bit the week Garfunkel was a guest caller. The film details the story of a young man who just graduated college and begins having an affair with his much older neighbor, who is also married. The older woman in question is Mrs. Robinson, which is what is being referenced here. As they prepare for the show, Frasier mentions that they're going to be on air for the next 3 hours. We've gotten an idea in the past of around what time Frasier's show is on the air, but I'm fairly certain this is the first time we've concretely heard how long it is. With the exception of the overnight spots, which can have 4-hour shows, this is about as long as any daytime radio slot gets. Fortunately for Frasier, he has guest callers and doesn't have to talk for the entire 3 hours. This week we have 2 guest callers. Our first is a woman named Linda, who is played by Betty Comden. Comden wasn't really an actress, although she did perform on both stage and screen from time to time. She was primarily a lyricist and wrote for musicals. The other guest caller, playing Linda's husband Walter, is played by Adolph Green. Like Ramberg and Flett, this two became writing partners, and most of what they've done together. They first met in college at New York University. There, they formed an acting troupe called The Reviewers. Their troupe proved to be somewhat successful, and they garnered a movie offer in 1944, which ended up with them getting 2 very small parts. After this somewhat disappointing outing, the troupe returned to New York, where they continued their work on Broadway. During their time on Broadway, they helped write a number of scripts, including Peter Pan, Say Darling, Do Re Mi, Fade Out, Fade In, Lorelei, and Singing in the Rain. They were also involved in 10 Hollywood musicals, including Good News, On the Town, Bells Are Ringing, and the Oscar-winning Singing in the Rain. Green passed in 2002 at the age of 87, and Compton passed in 2006 at the age of 89. There's not much else to note in this scene, other than Compton mentions that she's calling from her car phone. We've already seen Niall's cell phone in the past, and the fact that they're becoming more common is readily apparent here. Given the show ends in 2004, it'll be interesting to see when they make the transition to more than just the elite like Niles having a cell phone. The next scene, we find out that Eddie got a Barbie at the park he really likes, much to Martin's horror. The Barbie in question is from the 1993 model year, and is part of the My First Barbie line. There were 4 different Barbies that wore this outfit. The blonde one Eddie has here, which doesn't have an actual name beyond the My First Barbie tag, and item number 11294. There's also a Black, Asian, and Hispanic My First Barbies, which all wear the same outfits. The wild thing about this is just how many Barbies are out there. In 1993, there were 161 different Barbies released, and the following year, there were 181. Given the sheer number of different Barbie models that are out there, Eddie is lucky he found one that's so new. We learned in the first scene that Maris is in the hospital getting a facelift. In the next scene, we learn she hasn't been in the hospital much, except for the quote, the usual childhood things, tonsils, adenoids, force feeding. For those wondering, adenoids are part of the tonsils, whereas force feeding is something else entirely. Daphne's hair is pretty different again this episode, and really big. It feels kind of like Leah Thompson's in the Howard the Duck movie. It's so big and feels extremely 80s. This is another new style for Daphne, and although I do like it, I can't help but feel it's somewhat out of place in something taking place in the mid-90s. We also get another dirty joke from Daphne this week, involving the mole she got removed just south of Manchester. This was a really clever joke, and a nice bit of deviousness from Daphne. Although we haven't seen much of her psychic abilities this season, we have gotten to see a much less stuffy version of Daphne that feels more like she's a part of the family than anything else, which I, for one, really enjoy. It turns out Maris isn't the only person in the hospital. Martin's old partner, Artie, is also there, so the entire Crane clan decides to go to the hospital. While there, we meet Maris's doctor, Dr. Sternstein, played by Paul Kent. Kent was a very busy, that guy who was in that thing, actor, with over 100 credits to his name, starting in the 50s and continuing until 2013, 2 years after his death. Among his TV and movie studded career, Kent has appeared in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Hawaii Five-0, Starsky and Hutch, Three's Company, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Night Court, Doogie Howser, M.D., Port Charles, The West Wing, and ER. The man was amazingly busy and prolific in Hollywood, which makes it even more incredible that most people couldn't tell you his name if they saw him. Although it will be named later in this episode, we don't get the name of the hospital yet right here. What we do get is plenty of religious iconography to let us know it's a Catholic hospital. I thought this was a really nice touch by the set designers, including the picture of the Virgin and Child behind the doctor, and this somewhat ridiculous framed picture of the Pope on the waiting tables. For those wondering, this is most likely Pope John Paul II, who was Pope from 1978 until 2005. He took over the papacy from Pope John Paul I, who only served for 33 days before his untimely death. One other thing of note in this scene that I'm not sure if it's intentional or not is the inclusion of a lot of ringing phones in the background. In the past, we've seen ringing phones that definitely didn't belong there, and we're drifting in from other parts of the studio while the scenes were being filmed in Frasier's apartment. In this case, though, it could work either way, so I'm really not sure. But before we transition back to the apartment, we get to meet Martin's old partner, Artie Walsh. Walsh is played by Lincoln Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick is an interesting actor who actually knew jazz singer Billie Holiday, who encouraged him to pursue his acting career. Kilpatrick took this encouragement to heart and became a prolific actor. He played a cop a lot of the time, starting with his very first credited movie role in 1958, where he played a detective in the film Cop Hater. From there, he'd go on to appear in a lot of things, including NYPD, The Omega Man, The $6 Million Man, Soylent Green, where he played a priest instead of a cop, The Jeffersons, Benson, Doogie Howser, MD, NYPD Blue, ER, and the original Piranha. He passed in 2004 and was active in acting until 2002. His passion for acting extended beyond himself, and he took part in founding the Kilpatrick Cambridge Theatre Arts School in Hollywood. And he also was the first black member of the Lincoln Center Repertory Company. He's a very talented actor and a great addition to Martin's list of cop buddies. He also is one of those actors who just looks like a cop. We also get a quick look at Artie's wife in this scene. It's not a great shot, and I initially thought it was a picture of the Queen, based on the clothing that she's wearing. Anyways, our next scene opens with a title card telling us Albuquerque is approximately 136 square miles. This is one of those title cards that's talking directly to us, and will have a good bit to do with the next scene. It's also not at all correct. Albuquerque is around 188 square miles. I'm really not sure why this incorrect measurement was used here. If one of the numbers was wrong, it could have easily been an uncaught fat finger, but it's two incorrect numbers. I'm guessing Lloyd just didn't know the actual size when he was writing the joke and was too lazy to look it up. In any event, it's an oddity for the fact that it's here, it's a good joke, but it's incredibly far off. The next scene continues the fun B-plot with Eddie's Barbie doll, and gets us a great phone conversation between Niles and Maris, where we get to hear a lot of pet names Niles uses for his well-meaning wife. Among those pet names is Puppy Toes and my personal favorite, Niles' Little Wart. We also learn that the name of the hospital is the Little Sisters of Mercy, which just confirms what we already suspected about it being a Catholic hospital, based on the pictures in the waiting room. The choice of the name here is kind of a weird one. There is no Little Sisters of Mercy Hospital, but there are numerous Sisters of Mercy hospitals. The Catholic Women's Group was formed in Ireland in 1831, and has been involved in all kinds of religious outreach programs since then. They found their way to the US by the 1840s, and established their first hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1843. Today they've founded or co-sponsored dozens of hospitals in the US, and even more around the world. Pretty much any major hospital with the word mercy in its name is one of theirs. With that said, it doesn't appear they have a hospital in Seattle. Ignoring the fact that there's no Sisters of Mercy Hospital in Seattle, I find it a very strange choice to use a name so close to a real hospital branch, and not just use the real one. If they were going to make it a fake hospital, Lloyd should have come up with a name further from the truth. It turns out the reason Martin and Artie had a falling out is because Artie told everyone he saw Martin crying when they watched Brian's song in the bar one day. Martin denies he cries and says it was pretzel salt in his eyes. The truth of Martin's claim aside, I hadn't heard of Brian's song before this. That's probably in large part because it's a bit of a dated reference today. But in the 90s, it would have still been a relevant enough reference, especially for someone of Martin's age. Brian's Song is a 1971 ABC Movie of the Week film, which means it was a made-for-TV movie. It tells the story of Brian Piccolo, a Chicago Bears football player who falls ill with terminal cancer. For a television movie, it received fantastic reviews, and is often considered one of the greatest television movies ever made, and one of the greatest sports movies of all time. At the time of its premiere, Brian's Song was the most watched television movie of all time, pulling in 32.9 million viewers. It was surpassed in January 1972 by my all-time favorite television movie, The Night Stalker. Interestingly, the crown for the most viewed TV movie of all time currently rests with the 1983 Joe Beth Williams film, The Day After. which pulled in viewers from nearly 39 million households, which demolishes even Seinfeld's ratings by tens of millions of viewers. The film frequently still makes lists as one of the best TV movies of all time, and according to multiple critics and Entertainment Weekly, it still routinely ranks in the top 10, quote, guy cry, unquote, movie list today. So if there was a movie for Martin to tear up at, it sure sounds like this interesting piece of cinema and television history is it. Martin has a pretty good and slightly fourth wall breaking joke this week. He complains that Artie always had to have the last word, and just when you thought he was done talking, he'd start up again. Then a second later, Martin does exactly this. It's a pretty good joke, and the kind of more subtle humor I really appreciate from this show. We've had similar plot lines in the past about the characters putting aside their issues and learning to get along with other members of the cast or old friends. It's a common enough sitcom plotline, but it's also one that's true to life, and that's why it works. In this case, I thought we were going for the really dark ending. Frasier gets a phone call, and the dialogue makes it sound like something or someone has died. It's ultimately revealed Martin's transmission blew up, and the call has nothing to do with Artie. But I'll be honest, Martin wasn't the only one who was going from the phone call. I too thought we were going for a darker ending of the episode with possibly Artie's death. We get another one of those fun fourth wall breaking title cards before the next scene, where we applaud ourselves for not having a bedpan joke in this episode yet. Then, somewhat disappointingly, we proceed to not have a bedpan joke. I always enjoy little fourth wall winks like this, but it actually left me waiting for a bedpan joke before the end of the episode. Granted, that kind of joke is a bit crasser than what we'd expect from Frasier, but it doesn't mean I didn't want to see what clever one we got. We get some excellent and really funny reactions from Grammer when he sees the picture of Artie's wife, and her massive, caboose. I like this a lot, as it was a really funny reaction for Frasier, but I sort of wish we hadn't actually seen the picture in the prior scene. This is the kind of thing that is much better off being left to the imagination, and could have been done really simply with just a different location for the picture in the prior scenes. Ultimately, Martin and Artie resolve their differences with a few more good jokes, including Frasier babbling as he's ushered out of the door about how he shouldn't talk, and Niles again insulting Frasier's radio show, before handing gifts to Maris's medical staff to try and keep them from hurting her. Speaking of Niles handing out gifts, we have one more blink and you missed them guest stars, and that's Sister Mary Adler, who works the night shift, and Niles bribes her to treat Maris nicely. Adler is played by Lynn Adams, who has only appeared in a handful of things, including an episode of Guiding Light, 3 episodes of Secret Storm, and most recently, 22 episodes of All Downhill From Here. Perhaps, most interestingly, her sister, Brooke Adams, who is also an actress, has been married to Monk star Tony Shalhoub since 1992. Our Coda finds Eddie with a G.I. Joe like Martin wanted before he goes back to the Barbie. It's a nice Coda and a good Eddie joke. The G.I. Joe turns out to be a lot easier to identify than the Barbie. This is the Master Sergeant Duke version 2, from the Series 15 run of the G.I. Joe toys from 1992. Like the Barbie, this is a pretty common figure and one that's no problem for anyone to find today. Of interest to absolutely no one except myself, I actually have one of these figures I got in a box of stuff from a garage sale I hadn't gotten around to getting rid of yet. But since it's in this episode of Frasier, I might end up keeping it. On the tie front, Frasier only sports one tie this week, although it is a new one. Niles has 2 ties. His first tie is a repeat, making its 3rd appearance after last showing up in episode 5 of season 2. His second tie is more interesting, and is the 3rd tie he's worn this season that features a chicken on it. I'm not sure why David Hyde Pierce got all these chicken ties this season, but I really like all of them. Overall, Frasier is still 1 new tie ahead of Niles at 39 to 38 ties apiece. Outside of the episode Dukes We Hardly Knew Ye, this is the most Martin-centric episode we've had thus far this season. Unlike that episode, this one's heart doesn't center on the relationship between Frasier and his father, but is instead centered squarely on the relationship between Martin and Artie. It's always nice to get to see some of Martin's old friends, and Lloyd's prior outing, You Can't Tell a Crook by His Cover, did that quite well. This time it still works fine, but it isn't quite as fun, and the jokes aren't near as funny. That's not to say this is a bad episode. It's not. There's plenty of good, between Frasier's excellent reaction to seeing the picture of Artie's wife, to the entire B-plot involving Maris. There's some great and classic moments to be had here. There's just nothing exceptional. Ultimately, this is a fine episode. But with the exception of getting to see Martin get over an old grudge and the interesting history of Brian's song, there isn't anything to set this episode apart from being a filler episode. Well, we've come this far without a bedpan joke. So, number 1, I like this episode, but didn't love it. And number 2, it's a good, but not great, 7 out of 10.